we're happy to have a team of scientists from the Aldo Leopold Research Institute with us today, a group consisting of biologists, ecologists, and social scientists who are focused on pioneering research on wilderness and associated wildlands in the US and on a global scale as well. They will address in their talk themes about fire and landscape ecology, climate change, and their ecological and social dimension. So it's my pleasure to hand over to the team from the Aldo Leopold Research Institute.
All right. Let me know when you're ready, Chris.
Sorry, Jason. Sorry to interrupt. I don't think we can hear your sound.
No? Can you hear me now?
I can hear you.
I can hear you.
I can hear you.
I can hear you.
Okay.
Me too.
I assume everyone can hear me, and I'll take off from here.
Can you see the screen, I guess? Full screen? We looking okay?
I can. It's just perfect, and I will just say next slide when I'm ready to go.
Okay.
Thanks, Chris. All right. Greetings, everyone, from sunshiny and unexpectedly snow-covered Missoula, Montana. It looks fabulous outside right now. And before we begin properly, I just want to do a quick introduction and share a few thoughts. So first, I'm Jason Taylor. I'm the new director of the Aldo Leopold Wilderness Research Institute. And I'll share that I'm relatively new to the discipline of wilderness stewardship. My background has focused mostly on, or my background from two perspectives, one's from a management perspective and one from a science perspective, has focused on public lands and protected areas management, most recently as a national park superintendent, but also as a regional and national program manager. And then from the science perspective, my background's landscape ecology. My work over the last decade has focused mostly on broad-scale ecological assessments and developing national and international monitoring programs. So nearly all of this work has been outside of wilderness, not by design necessarily, but because the focus was on all public lands and wildlands and indifferent to designation. So over the last few months, since my arrival at the Leopold Institute, I've intentionally and even accidentally thought much more about wilderness as defined by law, but also what wilderness means or could mean beyond the prescription of law. And my experiences in Alaska over the last few years, and in the Arctic over the last decade, heavily influenced my perspectives on wilderness. So certainly don't know the path forward for wilderness, but from a perspective of learning and growth, I just want to share that I've tremendously valued and enjoyed the conversations here at the workshop over the last few days. So to say it a different way, it's a great pleasure to be here and to be participating in the first International Wilderness Week. So my goal in this session is to provide a primer of the place, the people, and the work from a framework perspective of the Leopold Institute, where scientists will then share some of their work. And as a first point of introduction, it's important to note administratively, the Aldo Leopold Wilderness Research Institute is part of the United States Forest Service, the Rocky Mountain Research Station. And at the same time, we equally serve all bureaus in the United States that manage federally designated wilderness, the Forest Service, but also the Bureau of Land Management, the United States Fish and Wildlife Service, and the National Park Service. Okay, next slide, Chris. So for those who, like me, may be new to the discipline of wilderness, I'll just share also a primer of wilderness. So in the United States Congress passed the Wilderness Act in 1964, creating 54 wilderness areas, totaling 3.7 million hectares across 13 states in the United States. This law also established the National Wilderness Preservation System. And since 1964, the wilderness system has grown almost every year and now includes 803 areas and over 100 million acres, 111 million acres, or 45 million hectares in 44 states and Puerto Rico. Next slide. The state with the most designated wilderness is Alaska, with just over 23 million hectares. The largest of the wilderness areas is Wrangell St. Elias. It's in the lower right corner, the lower right purple area here of the slide. And it's just over nearly 4 million hectares. There's a really interesting interpretive graphic in the visitor center at Wrangell St. Elias that shows the park itself overlaid with the states of New Hampshire and Vermont and Northeast United States. And the park, the wilderness areas plus the rest of the park together are larger than those two states in entirety. It's pretty amazing. The smallest wilderness area is Pelican Island Wilderness in Florida, Southeast United States. It also happens to be the area of the first wildlife refuge in the United States. So all told, if we include Alaska, roughly 5% of the United States is protected as wilderness. If we take Alaska out of the equation and look just at the contiguous United States, 2.7% of lands in the United States are protected as wilderness. Next slide, Chris. So the Aldo Leopold Wilderness Research Institute is a national interagency federal research facility located on the campus of the University of Montana. We're charged with helping to steward those 111 million acres of wilderness that I just spoke of. Next slide, please. Formerly, the Leopold Institute was established in 1993 as a research lead for the United States Wilderness, or the National Wilderness Preservation System. In fact, we're the only federal research group in the United States dedicated to wilderness science. We were preceded by a U.S. Forest Service Wilderness Research Unit, which was established in 1967. So all told, we have 5 decades of leadership, partnership in science, and knowledge and tools transfer, supporting managers, as well as collaborating with people like you, academic, non-governmental organizations, tribal, community members, and other wilderness stewards within the United States and internationally. So our mission, as written, is to provide scientific leadership in developing and using the knowledge needed to sustain wilderness ecosystems and values. Next slide, please. To meet our mission, the Leopold Institute maintains a core group of administrative staff and scientists, as you see on the screen here, many of which you'll hear from today. And I'll introduce the speakers in just a few slides. Excuse me. Next slide. In addition to our core staff, we have a rich history of hosting postdocs, students, and visiting scholars. And as mentioned, we have strong partnerships with wilderness stewards in the United States and abroad. It certainly takes all of us working together to do this important work. Next slide. Since this is an international conference, I'll also highlight that we have a history of hosting international scholars and fellows, and we've developed a fairly robust network of valued international collaborators over the years. And we're always open to finding new friends and developing new partnerships. If you're interested in collaborating with the Leopold Institute, or would like to learn more about becoming a visiting scientist, you can contact me directly or any Leopold Institute scientist. There's a how to contact the slide at the end of the presentation, and that will take you to all of our contact information. Next slide. So the work that we do, whether it be science or knowledge or technology transfer, typically falls into one of 3 broad categories. The first, science for wilderness, that being science and tools to inform effective stewardship of wilderness areas, resources, and values. And historically, this is where the Leopold Institute was most focused. And while this work certainly remains important today, about 15 years ago, our science direction was broadened to include wilderness for landscape sustainability. So science and tools to understand the values of wilderness, protected lands within larger landscapes from ecological, economic, and social perspectives. And wilderness for science. So using wilderness areas as scientific laboratories for baseline conditions to understand baseline conditions, to in part be able to understand change we're observing in other more directly impacted landscapes. Next slide. More specifically, our work over the last 15 years has been designed to address one of 5 research problem areas. And you'll recognize many of these themes in the coming presentations. So recreation experiences and the impacts of recreation on wilderness, relationships between people and wilderness values, or wilderness lands and values, wildland fire, wilderness stewardship within larger ecological and social systems, and the delivery of and application of scientific knowledge and tools. As a quick side note, we're just beginning the development of a new science charter to define our work over the next decade, and maybe this can be a topic for the next International Wilderness Week. All right, last slide here. So today we have 5 scientists presenting their work that they conduct at the Leopold Institute. So Carol Miller will talk to us about wilderness fire. Lisa Holsinger will show work on climate change in North America's vegetation. Sean Parks will present his work on climate change analogs and connectivity. Kathy Zeller will discuss wilderness and wildlife. Chris Armatas will round out the presentations by discussing wilderness social science. And so without further ado, Carol Miller.
Thanks, Jason. So I'm just going to take a few minutes to give you a real brief, quick taste of the research that we've done in the area of wilderness fire over probably the last 20 years, is when the Leopold Institute started working on the fire issue. And so our research really starts from looking at from the perspective of wilderness, that fire it's just a natural process. It's not a problem for wilderness. What is a problem is the act of suppressing fires in wilderness. So next slide. So suppression's a problem because it runs counter to the Wilderness Act. It interferes with the natural process, and that's led to a lot of ecological change, like what you see on the right, the vegetation change in less than 100 years, what occurred in the absence of fire. More trees, more biomass. And so when fire inevitably does occur, we see more extreme fire behavior and extreme fire effects that we might not be happy with. And I'm sure that if you've paid any attention to any headlines in the American press over the last few summers, you know that this is a real problem across much of our country, not just in wilderness. So next slide, yeah. So the policy for managing fire in wilderness really boils down to allowing lightning-caused fires to burn whenever and wherever possible. But unfortunately, we still see a lot of fires suppressed in wilderness for a lot of reasons that I don't really have the time to get into here. But there are some large wilderness areas that have not been doing so much suppression. They've been successful in letting most lightning-caused fires burn. So over the last 40 or 50 years, they've really provided us with valuable case studies for understanding natural fire regimes and ecosystem dynamics. And so these 2 papers that I have screenshots here of are kind of state of knowledge papers summarizing what's been learned. So next slide. So this fire history map on the right is from one of these success stories. The Bob Marshall Wilderness Complex. It's actually a complex of 3 different wilderness areas. And all together, they're about 650,000 hectares. So just by looking at this map, though, you can see how much fire has burned in the last 40 years. The different colors that are on the map indicate different decades of burning. So fire histories like these allow us to see the effect of multiple repeated fires that burn at natural intervals and during the natural fire season. So I've highlighted an example here where there are 3 different fires that have interacted with each other in just a 25-year span of time. The first one in 1988 and the most recent one in 2013. So next slide. So we're able to analyze fire histories from these success stories. And when we do that, we found that previous fires because they burn off fuels and they thin vegetation, we see that they tend to have a moderating or limiting effect on future fire behavior. They basically act like fuel treatments or fuel breaks that managers might implement on the ground. So we found that they reduce the number of new ignitions that can occur, so they lower the likelihood of occurrence. They inhibit the spread of fires, so they can limit how large the new fires can actually become. And then where fires overlap with previously burned areas, they generally burn with lower severity. So we've also found, though, that this regulating effect diminishes with time. So that makes sense. As fuels regrow, as vegetation regrows, this effect of acting like fuel treatment diminishes with time. And this effect diminishes more quickly in more productive ecosystems. And then we've also found that weather matters. So previous burns don't moderate fire behavior so well if we have extreme burning conditions. And you can probably see the implications for climate change from that. No, that's okay, Chris, you can go ahead. Okay, so in other work, we've helped support the case for letting fires burn in wilderness through spatial modeling. So in one study, we examined lightning-caused ignitions that were suppressed over a 10-year period of time. And we asked counterfactual questions. So what if we hadn't suppressed those fires? Where would they have spread? What would they have done? And we used a simulation model of fire spread to do this, along with the actual weather data that the fires would have burned under. And we found that the counterfactual landscape was dramatically different. It showed us that even a few seasons of fire suppression can have really lasting impacts, and that a single decision maker that might only be stewarding a wilderness for 5 to 10 years, they can make a huge difference during that short tenure in managing a wilderness. In other projects that also use spatial modeling, we've adapted risk analysis methods for the context of wilderness and letting natural fires burn. So risk analyses are often conducted for the purpose of identifying where to reduce hazardous fuels, but instead we've used them to map where and when fires can safely be allowed to burn. So the map in the lower right, the green zone on that map shows depicts like the opportunity that we have for allowing fires to burn. Ignitions that start in that green zone of it's the Selway Bitterroot Wilderness, they're not likely to leave the wilderness, even if they're just allowed to burn on their own for months at a time. So then next slide. We also hear a lot that there's a lack of public support for fire, and that's often assumed to be a barrier to letting fires burn in wilderness. And I think there's some truth to that for sure, but we've been able to look at surveys of wilderness visitors in the past, and we've been able to document a steady increasing support for letting fires burn. And I think that's probably because as we see more and more fire on the landscape, people get a little bit more comfortable with it and a little bit more used to it, and they see that it can have non-disastrous consequences. So that's just a taste of our past fire research, which has really been underscored by the problem of suppression, that intentional interference with wilderness. Our ongoing and future research is increasingly underscored by the unintentional interference of anthropogenic climate change. So we're asking questions about ecological trajectories in a changing climate, how fire will influence those. For example, we're looking at the role of heterogeneity on the landscape, like the heterogeneity that helps create so-called fire refugia, those unburned or lesser burned places on the landscape that are so important for post-fire recovery. And then we're also studying the increasing trend of vegetation conversion, for example, from forest types to non-forest types that can be triggered by fire and perpetuated by an increasingly hostile climate for trees. So that's all I'm going to get into here. And I'm going to close just with a list of references for some of the things that I mentioned today. And then there's more stuff on our website too that I didn't have a chance to talk about, but maybe there'll be a chance at the end. So I'll pass it on to Lisa, I believe.
Thanks, Carol. So we did a summary of a project where we looked at how climate change might reshape vegetation in North America's largest areas. Next slide, please. Thanks. Okay. So up until recently, managers have been working to preserve or restore protected areas to resemble conditions, the most natural conditions, historic conditions. Sorry about that. Chris, can you hear me?
I can now. I lost you there for a bit. Am I on the right slide for you?
Okay.
Sorry.
Sure. Actually, can you go back one slide, please? Okay. Anyway, our goal in this project was to develop fine-scale 1 kilometer vegetation maps of protected areas for mid-century and late century. Advance the slide, please, Chris. Thanks. Okay. So we chose to use a climate analog approach to make these projections of future vegetation. And this approach was developed from climate velocity models. And the process is to identify the locations that have the best climatic match between 2 different time periods. That is, you identify an area where the climate today matches or is analogous to the future projected climate for a place of interest. Next slide, please. Thanks. So I'll go through an example just to hopefully clarify this a little bit more. Let's say you have a site in Glacier National Park, and this park is located in the northwest part of the US in Montana, and its characteristic climate has been cold winters and mild summers. So let's say you have a site inside the park where the red stars are, and today this site supports cold montane forest, as shown in that Google Earth image on the upper right. And in 1975, this site had an average annual mean temperature of 2.06. And can you advance the animation, Chris? Thanks. Okay. Global climate models predict that the future climate of that site will be warmer and drier, about 5.17 degrees C on average by 2055. Next animation. One more. There, okay. So using the climate analog approach, we can identify that those warmer, drier conditions exist today downslope where the yellow dots are in an area called the Flathead National Forest. And those downslope analog sites today support dry conifer forest, and there's a photo there on the right with ponderosa pine and Doug fir. And advance the animation. Chris, thanks. So we would project that in the future, our site in Glacier may shift from cold montane forest to a dry conifer forest. Next slide. So I'm going to show results for one protected area and highlight the changes that we anticipate between now and the end of the century. So let's look at Yellowstone National Park, which is located again in the Northern Rockies of the US, shown in that red circle. And it's known for its geothermal features, such as Old Faithful Geyser, and for its abundant wildlife, such as elk, wolves, grizzly bears, black bears, to name a few. In advancing animation. Okay, today, which I call reference in this slide, today about 75% of the landscape is in cold montane forest, shown in these maps and bar chart in darker green color. And this cold montane forest is mostly made up of lodgepole pine, but also has spruce, subalpine fir, whitebark pine, and limber pine. And then at higher elevations, the park has a moderate amount of alpine habitat, shown here in gray. And then at the lower elevations, it has dry conifer forest in that light green color and shrublands in orange. And then by century's end, which is 2085 here, we project a complete loss of the alpine habitat at high elevations. So all that gray color in the maps and charts are gone. We expect cold montane forest in the darker green to decline. Then we expect dry conifer forest in light green and shrublands to increase across the landscape. In advancing animation. Thanks, once more. Okay, this core diagram shows the kinds of conversions in vegetation that may occur in the future. That is, if we're losing alpine habitat, what will it become? So starting with alpine habitat, we project that all of this habitat will be converted to cold montane forest, as the arrow points from the gray colored alpine to the dark green cold montane forest. In turn, we expect much of that cold montane conifer forest to remain so, and the arrow returns to itself, the same habitat. But a substantial amount may convert to dry conifer forest, and a smaller amount may convert to dry shrub habitat. And next animation. One more. Yeah, thanks. So if such forest transitions do take place, we can expect a cascade of ecological effects. For example, if we do see a substantial loss of cold montane forest, we could see significant losses to populations of the tree species whitebark pine, shown in these three lower photos. And whitebark pine is a keystone species, and its decline could affect many other species. The Clark's nutcracker, shown on the right there, harvests whitebark pine cone seeds and caches them. And then grizzly bears and black bears and many other species feed on these caches, providing them with a rich and reliable food source. And next animation. One there. Similarly, loss of alpine habitat would affect not only the plant species adapted to these extremely cold, windy areas, but the animals dependent on this vegetation, such as pika and marmot, bighorn sheep, and mountain goats. And next slide. Next, thanks. So just to sum up, the major trends and transitions that we expect in North American protected areas, that is that alpine cover, wherever it exists today, may be replaced by coniferous forest. Cold montane forest may convert to mesic or dry conifer forest. Dry conifer or mixed forest may convert to deciduous forest. And then in the more southerly protected areas, mesic, deciduous, and pine forest may shift to oak or dry deciduous forest. And then finally in the southwest of the US and Mexico, low elevation scrub, mesquite, and chaparral may move upward in elevation into protected areas. And the last slide. I thank you for your time. And if you have more interest in this work, please look into our publication in Conservation Science and Practice. And I'll hand it off to Sean.
Hi, Lisa, and hi, everybody else. Thanks to the European Wilderness Society for inviting us all to participate here. I actually want to start off with just a little bit of a personal note, just because just the importance of wilderness, I guess. Wilderness is important to me, both professionally and personally. You know, I work in wilderness. I conduct studies in wilderness. I've worked a lot on fire with Carol Miller, who talked earlier, and I work a lot with Lisa as well. And so wilderness is extremely important to me professionally, but also personally. You know, as a child, I grew up backpacking and hiking through wilderness areas. There's a picture of my brother and I from the Dinky Lakes Wilderness in California. That's from the late 1980s. And then more recently, my daughter in the Mission Mountain Wilderness in Montana. So I've got, you know, basically a deep respect for wilderness, both professionally and personally. And so just wanted to start off with that. A lot of the work I've done historically is focused on fire in wilderness. Again, I mentioned I worked with Carol a lot on these fire projects and also with Lisa on fire projects. But in more recent years, in addition to fire, I've been thinking a lot about climate change and about how organisms will be shifting in response to climate change and what that means from the protected area network. And so I'm going to talk about some of that research today. So Chris, can you actually go 2 slides up? I have way too many. Yeah, so we all know the temperature is increasing, right? It's pretty obvious, and we're seeing the effects of it in terms of increased flooding and increased fires and what have you. And we're going to see more warming. We're pumping a lot of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, and as a species, humans are not doing a very good job at limiting those emissions. I hope that does change in the future, because there are some worrisome trends emerging. You know, the fires are a good example that are occurring right now in the Western United States, but also have occurred in Europe and Australia. Next slide, please. So with climate change, we expect organisms to move, basically, or to shift their ranges. So here's an example of just one species in the North America, the black-capped chickadee. And we expect that organisms in general, and this organism, the chickadee, are going to have areas of range expansion as the climate warms, and that's shown in green, but also areas of range contraction, and that's shown in orange. So again, we expect organisms to move in response to climate change. And the general rule of thumb is that we expect organisms in temperate regions of the globe to move poleward and or upslope, just so they can maintain similar climate conditions as the climate continues to warm. Next slide. So what we've done at the Institute is, instead of looking at individual species, we think about just the climates. And Lisa showed a great introduction to how this works, but we think about what we call climate analogs. And if you look at the map on the right, what we expect is those green blobs. This is New Mexico, it's a state in the United States. So the green blobs in southern New Mexico have a certain climate. We expect those climates are going to be moving into Albuquerque, New Mexico by mid-century. So those climates are basically shifting poleward, right? We'd also expect that organisms that are associated with those climates will also shift towards Albuquerque, New Mexico. As another example on the left, there's a start and an end dot. The start dot has a certain climate that we are experiencing now, or over the last 30 years. By late century, we expect that climate is going to shift poleward or north, and also higher in elevation into the southern Sierras. This is in Southern California. And so that climate is essentially moving. The climate is moving, okay? And so we also expect that organisms associated with that climate are also going to move. And that's basically the impetus for a lot of these climate change models that look at species range shifts. Next slide. So because this is hosted by the European Wilderness Society, I wanted to show some European examples as well. Here are 4 tree species in Europe. Again, what we see is their areas of range contraction in red and areas of range expansion in dark blue. And one thing at the Institute that we've been thinking about a lot is how those organisms are actually going to get to the blue areas, like how they'd actually move across the landscape to shift their ranges. And in doing so, I guess what I want to highlight here, because I'm going to come back to it in a moment, is that These areas in blue, the areas of range expansion, are not always in the same country as where the species is currently. So we might expect there to be actually international or trans-boundary movement. And I'm going to get into this more a little bit later, but that's important from a conservation perspective under climate change. So next slide. So again, we've been thinking a lot about how organisms will move, and we've done a lot of modeling to actually identify paths of where we think organisms will move in response to climate change. So here's Yellowstone National Park, for example. And all the black dots show the terminal node, or basically the end point of where the climate in Yellowstone National Park will be in the future. So basically the climates are moving outside of the park. The current climates in Yellowstone National Park are leaving Yellowstone National Park. And again, just to reiterate for the 7th time, that we expect organisms to also follow these climates and basically move out of the park. And Lisa showed a great example of Yellowstone National Park in her talk a few minutes ago. So we have these paths, right? If we are not just focusing on Yellowstone National Park, but we build these paths, say, for the entirety of North America, we can start to look at patterns, geographic patterns. Next slide. And so here's an example. If we look at all the paths of these what we call basically climate paths or climate connectivity paths, and we add them all together and overlap them in a GIS, we get these cool maps that show basically what we're calling climate corridors. So the redder areas are more important in terms of facilitating range shifts under climate change. So we've done some work here looking at how these climate corridors overlap with protected areas, but also what an important implication of this work is, as a global community, there's interest in expanding the global protected area network. This could actually provide some guidance on where we might want to start adding protected areas. Areas that are important for climate connectivity, for example, might be one prioritization scheme, so we can help these species and these organisms survive climate change and shift their ranges. Chris, can you go to 2 slides? So getting back to Europe, we've done some of this work globally. And so here's an example from Europe. The green areas on this map's kind of busy, I apologize. The green areas show the protected areas in Europe, and the black lines basically show the connections between these protected areas under climate change. And again, as these species move between protected areas, their end protected area might not be in the protected area, or might not be in the country that the protected area started in. So these organisms might be moving between one country and another country. And we've done some modeling to show that. Next slide. Actually, next 2 slides. Yeah, right here. So no, back one. Yeah, there, perfect. So these are core diagrams. Lisa showed one earlier, and they're kind of complicated, but the left one shows Western Europe, and the right one shows Central Europe, I believe. And what this is showing is basically the percent of climates in protected areas that are moving out of the country. So I highlighted the 4 countries here that all have European Wilderness Society offices: Austria, Ukraine, Slovakia, and Italy. And what you see is in Austria, 51% of the climates in protected areas are actually moving outside of Austria. In Ukraine, 91% of the climates in Ukraine, in the protected areas in Ukraine, are moving outside of Ukraine, based on our modeling. In Slovakia, that value is 80%, and in Italy, 44% of the climates in protected areas are moving out of Italy. And so this is just important from a, thinking about international conservation. Different countries have different land use policies. They have different conservation policies, and the borders themselves sometimes can act as barriers, right? So when we're thinking about conservation into the future, thinking about this potential for transnational movement, as these organisms shift in response to climate change, I think is really important. And that's kind of one of the many directions we're going right now. I just wanted to highlight this last result before I concluded the talk. So I'm finished, Chris.
All right. Thanks, Sean. That was great. Hi, everyone. My name is Kathy Zeller. Can everyone hear me? Okay. Yeah. Okay. Thanks. So I am a research biologist with the Leopold Institute, and I just want to say how great it is to be here with you all today. Thanks for having us and giving us some time. So like a bunch of folks at the Institute, I'm also a landscape ecologist, and I tend to integrate the fields of landscape ecology, wildlife biology, genetics, and statistics to better understand things like wildlife populations, wildlife movement, landscapes, and landscape change. So for my piece of this talk, I'm going to focus on the wildlife wilderness connection and needs for research. And I'm going to use this framework that was laid out in a paper by Dr. Schwartz, Dr. Hahn, and Dr. Hosak from 2016. Sorry, that's a typo. It's not 100 years from now. It's Schwartz et al. 2016. And they basically broke out the needs of the wilderness wildlife research into two broad categories. One is, how does wildlife affect wilderness character? And the second is, how does wilderness or areas with wilderness character affect wildlife? Next slide, Chris. So focusing on this first category to start, essentially certain species like grizzly bears or wolves or mountain lions, they might just by their presence evoke a sense of wild places or wilderness. Or maybe there are certain species of wildlife that are intricately associated with a particular wilderness area. So I have a desert bighorn sheep pictured on the lower right. And there is a Bighorn Mountains wilderness in Southern California, whose namesake is the bighorn sheep. So just the fact that a certain species resides in a place might contribute to its wilderness character. Next slide. But there might be a lot of threats to maintaining these species in these wilderness areas, right? So as Sean and Lisa talked about, climate change might be having really large impacts on species and the presence of species in certain areas. There have been studies that have actually shown that in the Northern Hemisphere, species are shifting their ranges 10 kilometers further north every decade. And some species just might not be mobile enough to track these changes into the future. Or there might be a lot of human-induced fragmentation that's preventing species from getting from their current climate to their future climate. So there's likely to be lots of changes in species composition in wilderness areas in the future. And the question remains, how do those changes affect wilderness character? Next slide. And then there's fragmentation. So fragmentation, I'm talking about anthropogenic fragmentation outside of wilderness areas, can actually have quite a large impact on wildlife inside wilderness areas. So you can think about migratory species that might spend part of their year in wilderness area, but also migrate out of wilderness. Fragmentation might prevent them from making these longer range movements. Or there might be species that exist at relatively low densities that need more than one wilderness or protected area to survive, and creating those networks that Sean was talking about of connected wilderness areas and protected areas. And the bighorn sheep I mentioned before is actually threatened by the dueling interacting effects of climate change and fragmentation. So again, we might be looking at very different suites of species in wilderness areas going forward. So research questions become, when do managers intervene and implement things like assisted migration or species reintroductions? And given the shifting baselines going into the future with climate change and vegetation change, when might these actions be successful and when might they not be? Reintroduction that might be successful in a couple of years might not be successful in the long term. Okay, next slide, Chris. So I'm gonna switch to talking about the other side of this framework, and that is, how does wilderness affect wildlife? So the assumption has always been, based on conservation biology principles, that large protected areas are inherently good for wildlife. However, that's not really been quantified directly. So there have been very few studies taking a look at how wilderness areas themselves are contributing to populations of wildlife. And this relationship might not be as clear-cut as we like to think. So I'm going to highlight a couple studies. We have the black-capped chickadee making an appearance again. There was one study that looked at a whole bunch of breeding birds and found that these breeding birds actually benefited from wilderness areas because their upland habitats were just more intact in wilderness. But conversely, there was also a study on boreal owls, and they found that owl populations outside of wilderness were actually far more productive than owl populations inside of wilderness. So you can see how this relationship is fairly nuanced and how we need more studies to really tease apart what's happening with a whole bunch of different species on the landscape. Next slide, Chris. And so this relationship has been studied even less at different spatial scales. So Schwartz and his co-authors break out this second box into 3 more boxes, and these are all at different scales of study. So on the left, we have how one wilderness area might influence one species, how many wilderness areas might influence one species, or how multiple wilderness areas are influencing multiple species on the landscape. So how does a larger network of wilderness and protected areas contribute to greater landscape biodiversity? And I'll be presenting an example of this third box on the right in some of my future work. So next slide, Chris. So I'm just starting to work in this ecoregion. It's called the Crown of the Continent. It's in the Rocky Mountains, and it spans the border between US and Canada, includes the states of Montana and the provinces of British Columbia and Alberta. And it's over 40,000 square kilometers and has a whole bunch of different land tenures in it, including this backbone of protected areas in green, and also a handful of wilderness areas. So essentially, we want to know how wilderness areas are acting as anchors for the conservation of species in this region. Next slide, Chris. So I'll be looking at a whole bunch of different species, from lynx to elk to wolverine to even 2 different fish species. And I will be quantifying habitat for these species and mapping connectivity for these species, both currently and into the future, given a changing climate and human development in the region. Next slide. Oops. Yeah, thanks, Chris. Yeah, so I'm just going to wrap up by bringing us back to this conceptual framework. And I wanted to actually add one more box that they didn't have in their original paper, and that is, how does wilderness management affect wildlife? So we've talked about areas, we've talked about character, we've talked about these other 2 sides of the equation, but we haven't talked about how things like controlling number of people that are accessing wilderness, maybe at different times of year, or maybe the fires that Carol talked about earlier, whether we're controlling fires or letting fires burn in wilderness, or whether we might be intervening to control an invasive species. All of these actions might have effects on wildlife as well. So I just wanted to add that to this framework. And that's all I have. So I will pass it off to Chris.
Thanks, Kathy, and everybody else. And yeah, my name is Chris Armatas. Really great to be here. I'm going to talk today about wilderness social science. And I'm the research social scientist currently at the Leopold Institute and started at March. So fairly new in my current position, although I've kind of been in the orbit of the Institute in postdoc positions and graduate work in the past few years at least. So in the next kind of 6 to 8 minutes, I'll present a broad and simplified overview of Alry's wilderness social science. Talk about some of my work, but also go back a little bit and talk about some of the history. And I'll briefly discuss kind of 3 general areas of social science. And then I'll add a quick mention of where you can find some of the resources that are available to help you in your discussions and work around wilderness and wild places. So not only kind of the social science, but some of what you heard today, where you might find some of that work. And so a big one is recreation. It's really one of the more traditional and extensive areas of wilderness research by the Leopold Institute. It's the bread and butter. There's a long history reaching back to the late 1960s, where discussions of social carrying capacity originated, where solitude research with a focus on monitoring encounters was stressed and integrated into recreation frameworks such as carrying capacity and limits of acceptable change. People like George Stankey and Bob Lucas were pioneers of this work. And much of that work still informs managers today, particularly in the United States, as managers actively track wilderness character. On the natural side of this recreation work is recreation ecology. So looking at how human use of wilderness has an impact on the ecological resources. David Cole was at the forefront of this field and did a lot of that work at the Leopold Institute, and a lot of that work is still available. And then there's also a long history of research focused on conflict, such as between different canoeists and motorboat users or hikers and stock users. There's been work on fees or the potential impact of charging fees for accessing wilderness lands, for example. Trust between the management agencies and the general public is another element of this on-site work, which has been pursued historically. And so kind of connecting that specifically within trust research has been done kind of within the context of fire management. So some of what you heard earlier from Carol, there's kind of the trust side of that has been investigated by the Leopold Institute. And then currently a couple projects that I'm working on the recreation context are developing a process to determine user capacity on wild and scenic rivers in the United States. That's a policy requirement that such rivers kind of have this number of people or uses on it. And so I've been working in the Salmon River around the Frank Church River No Return Wilderness on that. And then additionally, the very challenging problem of managing visitors in high use areas, such as some of national park wilderness areas and urban proximate wilderness areas. And this is a really dynamic issue. It's been studied in the past, of course, but I'm in the early stages of some new research on that topic. And then we have, this idea of, in addition to the recreation research, much of which is focused on the on-site recreation experience, work's also been done and continues to be done, focusing on how people relate to wilderness more broadly. So we can split hairs on some of these terms and distinguish the terminology, but really a great deal of social science has been focused on the human-nature relationships and relevance. So that is what beyond recreation is important or relevant about wilderness. There's the benefit of wilderness for its symbolism as a place representing human restraint and humility. There are there's benefits research has shown of subsistence use, exercising treaty rights, and practicing culture. Research focused on these benefits to indigenous peoples has been completed, particularly within Alaska and the circumpolar north. And I say this with complete acknowledgement to yesterday's really engaging discussion about wilderness and maybe some of the other sides of it as well, and some of the conflicts there. So calling back to yesterday morning's presentation a little bit there. Some of the offsite benefits, such as water quality as well and air quality, have been stressed through ecosystem services research. I've been involved in a lot of that, as well as a look at how kind of social well-being is threatened by a variety of drivers of change, including climate change. And so the Leopold Institute's long participated in and supported research that has allowed us to kind of more clearly articulate the various benefits, the relevance of wilderness, and the ways we might adapt in the face of a variety of stressors. And I think future research on the relevance of wilderness to different cultures and social groups is certainly on the list of research needs. And there is a lot of areas that still require, I think, investigation, and hopefully the Institute goes that way in the future. And then lastly, I'll talk about kind of this third topic area broadly of broad area of social science, of applied tools, research that's focused on decision-making process or practical ways that managers and planners might, develop stronger relationships with the public who they are serving. And one tool that is broader than social science for sure, but it needs to be mentioned as it's heavily used within the U.S. management of wilderness, is Keeping It Wild, both 1 and 2. This effort was led by Peter Landris, who's a current emeritus scientist. You saw him on an early slide. And it's really the foundation for wilderness character monitoring, which is a program that's been formalized within wilderness management. Indeed, I've kind of recently heard manager refer to Keeping It Wild as their Bible. So it's being used, it's applied pretty much every day, and it's something that came out of the Institute. And additionally, some of the work that I've focused on in recent years is improving public engagement approaches for broad scale planning processes. So not only wilderness, but kind of beyond that, to national forests, wild and scenic rivers, even at that project level, if you kind of focus in. I'm working on some public engagement on a restoration project right now that kind of borders wilderness. And there are requirements for public engagement for kind of all of these, broad scaling or project level. The US managers are kind of and planners are required to engage that public about projects and plans. And the ecosystem service trade-off approach is something we've honed in recent years. And so my hope is to continue research in that area going forward, which is generally public engagement. I see it as a massive need. It's really struggle. It's a real challenge to integrate structured social science into that process. And so finally, kind of the health of the NWPS is relying on successful collaboration between both government and non-governmental partners. So shared stewardship is something being stressed, particularly in the Forest Service. And it's really another budding area of governance work that I hope to continue into the future. We've done a little bit of research on that recently at the National Wilderness Workshop in 2019. Had some kind of engagement with the folks there about what are the challenges and barriers to good shared stewardship. And so I'll just kind of wrap with a plug for our publication and archive page. So for anybody out there who heard something today, if there's a publication you're interested in, if the Leopold Institute was involved with it, it's posted. You don't have to have access to these journals, for example. There's no paywall. It's free there to the public. Anybody who wants it, you can go and download any publication. There's hundreds of publications that you can search in that database. And then there's also this archive, which right now has 54 data sets for download. And that's a Forest Service hosted archival page. And it's growing every day. We're submitting new ones. And so could be data sets for you to use, students to use. It's just a really great resource. If you want to do trend studies, there's data there to be downloaded and used. You can search by keywords. A lot of survey research, ecological studies as well, recreation ecology studies. A lot of David Cole's work is there. There's some fire atlas maps available for you as well. And so I just wanted to throw that resource out there for you. And so we will wrap it up with some questions in the last 5 minutes or so. Thank you for your time.
Hi, thank you guys for your very interesting updates on the wilderness situation and the effect of climate change on the future of wilderness in the US and the Americas as well. Yes, as Chris said, does anyone have any questions they'd like to ask the team from the Leopold Institute? If so, please put it in the chat or in the Q&A, or you can also raise your hand and ask the team directly. If not, I'll start with a few questions of my own while everyone else is thinking of some of theirs. Yeah, I'd just like to touch on the policy element of climate change adaptation. What is the process for policy change in relation to connecting wilderness areas? Obviously, at the minute, some areas are classed as wilderness areas, and some as national parks and reserves. As the species move from their current areas to more suited to areas with climate which are more suited to them, how can policy adapt to that as well? How can the government at the state level or federal level instigate new protected areas to protect these vital corridors for species migration?
I'll take a stab. This is Sean. That's a good question, and I don't actually have a good answer because it's up to individual governments to deal with that. Hopefully, I would hope that governments and even nonprofit organizations such as land trusts and the Yellowstone to Yukon initiative and what have you would use the science that we've produced to either advocate for additional protected areas or advocate for increased connectivity among protected areas as the climate changes. But also I would hope that our government and all other governments out there take this seriously and make a big push. There are international pushes, for example, to get 30% of the globe protected by 2030 or 50% by 2050. So if those initiatives are successful, we're providing some information about where to expand the protected area network, and hopefully, this isn't the one piece of information that should be of concern. There's a lot of information out there, but hopefully the science we produced could be a piece of the puzzle in the decision making on where to expand protected areas.
And I'll just jump in there and add a little bit more to what Sean said. This is Kathy. So in terms of the policy side of things, all of our national forests in their management, they're mandated to account for connectivity and climate change going forward. So how well that's been done so far is up for debate, but it's definitely is part of the policy. There's also a National Wildlife Corridors Act that's been introduced to Congress, and might see some movement on that in the coming years, depending on the political situation. And that will definitely facilitate the incorporation of connectivity across federal lands. And then finally, there's the Great American Outdoors Act that just passed that has a lot of funding for targeted acquisition of lands to protect. So that could also, some of the prioritizations that say Sean has done or others have done can inform where the prioritization of those acquisitions.
That's great to hear that that the politics is moving in the right direction, and that your research is supporting these decisions in the policy arena. One question for Lisa about the Yellowstone National Park. You were saying that there was a pine tree species that was a keystone species in the Yellowstone Park. I was just wondering what the effect of, if this keystone species was to be lost, what would its effect on the ecological value of the ecosystem be?
Well, it potentially could be a big loss, because as I was talking about, the pine cones are the Clark's nutcracker caches the seeds from the pine cones, and there's a whole lot of species that at this point feed on those seeds. So if we lose that tree species or it travels north, that source of food will no longer be there. So the other species like black bears and brown bears, they'll have to look for another source of food, and time will tell how successful they are at that. But at this point, it's certainly a concern.
Great, thanks very much for that, Lisa. Does anyone from the audience have any questions of their own at the moment? If not, I'd like to say a big thank you to everyone from the Aldo Leopold Wilderness Research Institute for their time and for giving us a comprehensive overview of what climate change means for the future of wilderness in America and the ecology of America, and also the social dimension of involving people in wilderness and what wilderness means to them. So big thank you to everyone at the Leopold Research Institute, and yes, thank you very much.